Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of Startups Unedited. Today I'm really excited to be joined by my friend Ravi Belani, who is CEO your founder, CEO at the Alchemist Accelerator program, which is now global. You've built an empire. And in my opinion, I know I'm biased because we're friends, but I think you have the most important enterprise-based organization of its kind, period, on planet Earth. So thank you so much for joining us here today.
Oh, it's an honor to be here, Jorge. I'm excited to be here with you. So it's so much fun to actually be on the other side. And I've been an admirer of everything that you've done for so long with startups and also just the miraculous stuff around growth hacking. So it's always super fun to be with you, Jorge. It's a privilege. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. And I got to say, we've been actually collaborating for many, many years. I remember when you first started, and I am astonished at what you've been able to build again. So just being able to see parts of it from the inside too is just unbelievable. But let's dive in here. We were just in the green room talking about the impact of, you guessed it, folks, AI, and the impact that it's had on a lot of different areas of our species and society, but particularly as it relates to product and valuations and these sort of things. Ravi, what's your perspective when we live in a world where you can vibe code something that would have taken 3 years now in maybe a week and a half, right? Like literally. Like, what does that do for product valuations? What does that do to M&A? Like where are we standing here today?
It's a great question, and I think it's such an unusual time in venture. So my background, just to give people context, is before founding Alchemist, I worked at DFJ, which was a preeminent venture capital fund. They funded Tesla and SpaceX and Skype and all these great companies for 5 years, and so that was sort of a traditional VC fund. And then I've worked at Alchemist now for the last 14 years, where we're pre-seed. We're dealing with companies when there's just 1 or 2 people and they're starting out. And so I've seen both sides. And I also teach entrepreneurship in the engineering school at Stanford. So I see the Stanford kids and all the valuations that are happening to them when they're graduating. And it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. It's the best of times because if you are an entrepreneur with an idea, in the past, having a technical co-founder was a bottleneck, but potentially to execution. You needed to get that solved. And today we are seeing amazing companies with amazing traction without necessarily having a deeply technical co-founder. And so that's a phenomenal opportunity, which I think is going to democratize entrepreneurship even more. And at the same time, it's the worst of times because the intensity level for startups has also elevated. So if you're going after an idea because you're chasing money, likely there's going to be several, if not hundreds of other competitors that are going after the same idea. So what does that mean to your question in terms of valuations? Is the velocity of development has increased. I mean, is shorter than it's ever been before. And also the velocity of revenue is higher than it's ever been before. So you have companies right now that are going from 0 to 100 million in ARR in a year. Like if you look at Mercor or some of these other companies. I just had the CEO of Gamma, which is
I was just thinking Gamma, unbelievable.
And if you look at Gamma, that CEO used to work at Optimizely as the CFO, as the COO of Optimizely. And at Gamma, he's intentionally, the team, he says, at Gamma is 10x as productive per employee as Optimizely was. And Optimizely was sort of the king of A/B testing and operationalizing product development. But he can do so much with such a small team that AI has really empowered non-technical teams and moderately technical teams can now build incredibly quickly and do a lot more than they've ever done in the past. What that means for entrepreneurs and then for valuations is it is I know that you're talking about the applications, but let me just take a step back and then I'll talk about it, is that on the AI front for valuations, you're building there's either AI infrastructure where you're actually building things that could be in the new AI stack at the LLM level or at the infrastructure level where you're building some meta tools that you're going to need to build the applications. And for those, the valuations can get obscenely high with very little revenue based on if you get talent, because there's very little talent that can build those types of companies. And so just taking another step back, and I'll get to the answer. The thing that's interesting about the venture industry is that about 50% of the VC dollars have gone into just 9 funds. Okay, so there's 9 funds in Silicon Valley that have absorbed 50% of the dollars that fund the venture capital industry. Now, those 9 funds, and I'm talking about funds like NEA and Sequoia and Andreessen Horowitz and Lightspeed. These guys have sucked up these mega funds. They're deploying billion-dollar-plus funds. And if they have to deploy that much capital, it's easiest if they can deploy bigger checks into fewer companies from a management perspective. So if you can signal that you are building a company that's not just $1 billion company, but $100 billion company or $1 trillion company that can help pay back one of these mega funds, they are valuation insensitive. So that's why, like Anthropic, with 0 revenue, they raised their first raise, their Series A was $150 million at $1 billion post-money valuation. And the math around that was really basic. It was just Andreessen had a $3 billion fund. They wanted to, if they did 20 investments, that's like $150 million each. And they wanted to own at least 15% of the company. So it's literally like, that's literally the complexity of the math. It's like, I think this can become a $100 billion company or $1 trillion company. And so I can write a check up to 150 million and I need to own at least 15%. And so if you're building at the infrastructure level, it's not about traction. It's just about the team and the vision. Then you have AI companies that are execution, which is what you're talking about. So, I can build an app quicker than I've ever built an app before. And because of that now, what's becoming critical is if you can master the tweaks on the feedback loops between the customer and the product. So getting those tweaks correctly, even if you have the idea that there should be an AI for this, there still is a lot of non-technical complexity in customer development, what we classically call customer development, product market fit. So validating that, in fact, you're tweaking the product to what the customers really want, and the interface is working on how they want to work it. If you can get the design correctly, then the technical ability to build is easy. And now then the issue becomes how quickly you can grow. So the bar has shifted. Again, companies used to before it was like trying to get to 10 million. Before the heuristic was you wanted to get to $1 million of ARR in 12 months with certain scores around your unit economics. Now the best of breed is getting to 100 million in a year. So the bar has shifted. You're trying to get to at least $3 to $6 million of ARR within a year if you can. If you can get to those metrics, though, the valuation multiples you're getting, if you can be growing at a certain clip, are around 30x revenue. Like we had an Alchemist company that just got to 8 million of revenue, and they raised at a 270 post, a 240 pre. Okay, so it's around you're getting like these 30x multiples on revenue, and that's partly because there is a little bit of a fervor happening where there's a big execution land grab, and there's this moment where you're seeing, if you're getting the UX correct, AI can really suck up a lot of cash in key verticals. The key thing, though, then, is to make sure that you actually can maintain that revenue and that growth. And that's the question that you should be thinking about as a founder is, where is the competitive advantage long term? So assume that you prove out a market. Given how easy it is to build code, assume that you're going to have 10 fast followers at least that just replicate what you're doing. You have to ask yourself, if there's a fast follower that replicates what you're doing, why do you win? Is that might be because you have a network effect. So like we have a company called Lodex, an Alchemist, that's doing truck dispatching. So Alchemist is focused on enterprise. It's industrial. It's it's unsexy industries, very sexy to us, but unsexy to the world. And so, we have when the company was working in truck dispatching, just thinking about the software and the technology to dispatch trucks. And they've AI enabled that whole process. So you don't need a human in the loop. It can all be AI enabled. But there is also a network effect at play, because once you use the vertical AI software, then they have a marketplace of truck dispatchers that can source, where they can source from a community of trucks to fulfill orders. So it starts off as a software product, but then it leads to a networked solution. We have another company called Bestie, which is doing AI for property managers. And similarly, there's a long-term opportunity to create a marketplace where you're solving a lot of the painful parts of being a property management using AI. And then it can build towards, once they have that, they can build out a network of property managers that can work with each other. So thinking about a competitive advantage that has nothing to do with tech, where even if somebody replicated the tech a day later, they can't replicate the value, because the value longer term is in the network. So that's a classic strategy to try to create a competitive moat. But the other things are just to start to actually build your own platform. So if you look at Gamma, which I know we talked about before, not an Alchemist company, I think the world of that company, though I think they're phenomenal and fantastic. But Gamma's creating, they were building AI for, and the Gamma CEO spoke in my Stanford class, and you can see that talk online. We posted it online, so you can watch it directly from, listen directly from the Gamma CEO. But what I love about that story with Gamma is he was creating AI for slides, effectively like AI for PowerPoint. So every single investor that he talked to, brought up the example of, why can't Microsoft do this? Why wouldn't Google Slides do this? And, the beautiful thing about, I think, his approach or model is that there's always going to be an opportunity for an incumbent to try to replicate what you're doing. But as a startup, the advantage that you have is to approach things differently, and then start to build a community around that's different over time. So even though he only had a fraction of the people that are using PowerPoint or Google Slides to use Gamma, Gamma operates differently than PowerPoint or Google Slides. And once you start to use the platform, then you're sort of locked in to that platform. So if you want to build extensions or certain graphics, or start to change your PowerPoint to a website, you're locked into the Gamma environment. And that also creates, a lock-in effect. You're not going to move to another. If I create Ravi Amma, the next day, you won't use my product, even if it's technically identical, because all of your historical assets are already on Gamma. And so you can't, that's more difficult to sort of port over. So you just need to find a passionate group. Ideally, it's not a large group, but it's a group that's deeply passionate about what you are doing. And you need to do things differently than what anybody else is doing. And that is the secret path towards unlocking more and more value. So it is feast and famine on valuations, to your question, Jorge, which is why it's a weird time to be an entrepreneur. It's the best of all times and it's the worst of all times, because innovation and success is so near, it's so palpable, and yet you're going to see a few companies raise huge amounts of money and get huge premiums for valuation, for traction, and then lots of other companies that seem pretty identical, that you're like, I've created almost the exact same thing that this other person has, that get $0. And that's partly a function of the concentration of the industry. Like 9 funds are controlling half of, where the bulk of the capital is going in. And so if you get the interest of one of those 9 funds, you're in heaven. And if you don't, it's almost impossible. You're really struggling. And there is a huge variance in being marginally better. So like if you have just a marginally better product where you're growing at a faster clip than the next alternative, the VCs will pour a disproportionate amount of money into you. So you want to try to get to that $3 to $6 million of ARR. You want to try to grow at 4 to 7x year over year growth to get to those 30x multiples on revenue. And then you're feeding the cycle continually to just outbeat your competitors that are all going to be trying to replicate you quickly. So we're going through that phase. then there's also this question about how does this all consolidate? Everybody's talking about an AI bubble, and where does will the revenue ultimately be able to support the valuations that are given, which is we can go into it later. I know that was just the first question and I consumed a lot of time. So let me pause and we can go forward to other topics.
Well, I think one of the things that sort of came up for me as you were kind of explaining the distinctions between the type of organization that you're building, whether you're infrastructure or building these applications. And I think that's a really, really important nuance that maybe would have existed to an extent in the past, right? But now are like really, really critical, it seems to me. And the other thing that comes to mind is, does this mean, Ravi, that things like your go-to-market strategy and the kind of the competitive kind of plays that you can deploy around go-to-market and building brand and these sort of things are more important than ever? Like, for example, building a community you mentioned, right? Like being able to do that now is probably, and I don't know this to be true, maybe you can kind of provide some feedback around this, is probably more valuable than ever because the building of a product, particularly on the application side, is largely commoditized.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you have to suddenly, your technical moat is thin in general. And the other nuance about why that's the case is about 50% or maybe 40% of venture dollars. Again, we talked about that industry structure thing. 40% of venture dollars have gone into 9 companies. So if you look at like OpenAI, which raised $40 billion. Okay, so one startup raised $40 billion in their last round. XAI, $20 billion. Anthropic, $20 billion. Those aren't really startups. They're not really companies. They're actually raising as much money as like the top, historically, like the top 10 venture funds. Okay. So what's really happening is that, and the way that companies are getting built now is different because of that. Because what's really happening is that you have these large funds that are basically funding companies that are trying to become public companies on day 0, where they're pre-funded with a ton of capital, and they're trying to take over the whole industry. So they're trying to capture all the economics in AI effectively, and so that informs then how you have to compete if you're at the application layer. Because on the one hand, you're going to benefit from all of these platform players trying to get you to build on their LLMs and their platforms. So they are artificially cutting price so that you can benefit from the technology because they're trying to build up their communities, as you're saying. And then you, as an application executioner, you need to think about how do you survive? Because if you build a market that is so big that it gets on the roadmap of the platform players, they're going to compete with you. So in some ways, it is sort of similar to vertical AI is the old enterprise SaaS. So if you remember before, like we had all these cloud computing platforms, instead of the LLMs, you had AWS and Google, and it's the same players effectively, and Microsoft, and they would Costcoize applications. So if you built out an amazing, if there was an amazing vertical application that was needed, they would have one on their stack that you could use, and that could kill the competition. And so then you have to think about how do you, but even despite that, there are amazing companies that get created that become standalone concerns. And so this is getting to your point. You need to think about how you get there. One element is community. So I do think that becomes pretty critical, is how do you create a community around what you're doing? But there's other ways to compete as well. The other classic ways is, and this is what's happening, is to go really deep vertically. So, there are certain applications right now where Salesforce is putting a lot of attention, for example, on small, and I know Salesforce is not a startup, so this isn't sort of fair, but there's a lot of small language models where you're creating these trade-offs between lower compute usage and limited functionality, but very effective for certain use cases or narrow in scope. We have a company called Caspix, which is putting AI in analog chips so that you don't need to go to the cloud to actually get your AI response. It can be much more immediate, much cheaper, but it's also limited in terms of its functionality. So there's different ways. So you can think about competing differently. You can also think about competing vertically. So thinking about all the different elements that are going to be needed on the vertical stack that you're going into. So everything that's happening before or after what you're dealing with to solve for that. But the broader point is a very valid one. If you can do also community, that's also really fantastic. So, and this is, again, if you go like to the example for me of Gamma's building a community of people that are really passionate about changing PowerPoint and Google Slides. And they have a community that's passionate about the product. And then, I think over time, they're going to open up APIs for people to build and extend the platform. I imagine that's what they're going to do. And so, they haven't said anything like that, but then that creates a network effect of people building and extending. So I do think you should think about everything as a platform. I think right now, the days of just having a simple application, you're going to be confronted with intense competition. And so I do think that is sort of the way to go.
Awesome. Ravi, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom. I just want to give a shout out to Tom Brown, who's one of the founders over at Anthropic, who was an engineer at Mopub.
Really?
He was actually founding engineer at Mopub, who left to go and do a thing called Grouper, which was like a group dating application, which didn't work out. And then, now his next thing was wild.
And I think it's a really important note, because I think it's very tempting when you're an entrepreneur here to deify and demonize people. You can think about, these founders that are raising these huge rounds, they're just of a different nature. And I'm not able to succeed because there's something intrinsically wrong with me. And that is not true. So, the virtue of what you're doing, Jorge, is to humanize the whole founder experience and to bring people in to get that perspective. But all these founders are just people. They just happen to do a couple things that are shifted, which allows them to take off, in these amazing ways.
Absolutely. Well, Ravi, if folks wanted to follow your content or maybe learn more about The Alchemist, what are the best channels or URLs to reach you?
Yeah, so if you just Google Alchemist Accelerator, you'll get to this site. It's the Alchemist Accelerator. You can follow me on X at @Belani, or you can connect to me on LinkedIn. And at Stanford, we do stream our speaker series, the speaker series that I co-teach, and that's at ecorner.stanford.edu.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and have a great new year.
You too, Jorge. 2026, I think it's going to be a very tumultuous, disruptive year. It'll be interesting.
It's going to be awesome. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, take care.
Take care.